Humanity learned that the universe was crowded on a day that should have been ordinary. The discovery did not arrive with fire in the sky or voices booming from orbit, but with a slow, methodical correction to a long, trusted map. Deep-range observatories, built to refine measurements of stellar drift, began returning data that refused to agree with established models. A distant system flickered, not with the randomness of cosmic noise, but with the deliberate cadence of engineering. The light bent where it should not have bent. The radiation signature carried structure where nature favored chaos. At first, the analysts argued among themselves, certain that an instrument was miscalibrated or a dataset corrupted. Human history had taught them caution and the cost of premature certainty, but repetition has a way of grinding down skepticism. When the same irregularities appeared across independent platforms, across continents and orbital arrays, the conclusion became unavoidable. Someone else was out there, and they were doing something large enough to disturb the sky. The first response was not celebration or terror, but logistics. Humanity had spread far enough among its own stars to understand the fragility of civilization. Colonies depended on long supply chains, habitats balanced on precise tolerances, and political systems that rarely agreed on the definition of shared good. News of another intelligence threatened to destabilize all of it, so the revelation was held back while governments and consortiums argued over who had the right to speak for the species. During that delay, the data continued to arrive, and the picture sharpened. The alien construct was not a ship in the sense humans understood, but a lattice of mass and energy spanning a significant fraction of its host system. It gathered stellar output, redirected it, and shaped gravitational flows with an elegance that suggested long practice. Whoever built it had not merely mastered space, they had learned to persuade it. The debate over first contact grew vicious. Some argued for immediate outreach, believing that any intelligence capable of such feats would either already know of humanity or be indifferent to their small transmissions. Others urged silence, warning that drawing attention could invite annihilation. What united them was an unspoken fear that humanity would be judged and found wanting. The species had clawed its way out of gravity wells through stubbornness and improvisation, not through the kind of serene control the alien structure implied. Humanity was still messy, still loud, still prone to conflict. In the quiet halls where policy was shaped, many wondered if that messiness would be seen as a flaw or a threat. The decision was forced by an event no one had predicted. A probe sent decades earlier on an automated survey trajectory passed close enough to the alien construct to trigger a response. The response was not hostile, but it was unmistakable. A focused emission reached out, scanned the probe, and altered its course with a precision that bordered on gentleness. The probe, battered by interstellar dust and running on redundant systems, recorded the interaction before being guided onto a trajectory back toward human space. The message was clear in its own way. We see you, we can touch you, we choose not to break you. When the probe returned, its data package ignited a storm. The emission had not damaged the probe, but it had left a signature embedded in the probe systems, a pattern that repeated across frequencies and physical states. It was not a language as humans understood language, but it was information dense enough to be unmistakably intentional. Teams of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers tore into it, hunting for structure. They found it in the relationships between values, in ratios that echoed universal constants, but tweaked just enough to signal choice rather than inevitability. This was an introduction written in the grammar of physics. Humanity answered with a transmission of its own, a carefully curated package of mathematics, biology, and history compressed into patterns of light and radio. It was sent from multiple locations to avoid the appearance of a single authority. The reply came faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, the alien construct shifted its output, redirecting energy into a beam that traced a path through interstellar space, stopping just short of human territory. Along that beam rode a message far more complex than the first. It contained models, predictions, and an invitation. The invitation was not phrased as a demand. It was an offer of exchange, of meeting at a location chosen for its neutrality. The aliens proposed a point in deep space, far from inhabited systems, where representatives could approach without fear of immediate retaliation. The conditions were precise, the constraints clearly stated. No weapons beyond personal defense, no mass capable of destabilizing local space, no deception in the physical parameters of the meeting. It was, in essence, a request for honesty in a universe that rarely rewarded it. Selecting a human representative was harder than building the ship that would carry them. Every candidate brought political baggage, cultural bias, and personal ambition. In the end, the choice fell on a woman named Mara Sen, not because she was powerful or famous, but because she had spent her life navigating between systems that did not trust each other. She had been born on a marginal world, educated through a patchwork of institutions, and risen through negotiation rather than force. Her career was defined by compromises that held because she understood the cost of collapse. She was not the smartest human alive, nor the bravest, but she was adept at listening without surrendering her core. The ship built for the journey was a testament to human pragmatism. It was not beautiful in the way the alien construct was beautiful, but it was resilient. Redundant systems layered upon each other, hull plates designed to deform rather than shatter, engines tuned for reliability over speed. It carried with it the distilled knowledge of a species that had learned to survive in hostile environments. Every bolt and circuit spoke of lessons paid for in blood and vacuum. Humanity did not know what it would face, but it knew how to endure. As the ship approached the meeting point, Mara felt the weight of history settle on her shoulders. She was not naive enough to believe that one conversation could define the fate of her species, but she understood that first impressions carried a gravity all their own. She reviewed the data again and again, tracing the alien patterns, rehearsing responses to questions that might never be asked. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of vast structures and indifferent stars. The meeting point was marked by a distortion in space, a gentle fold that held position without mass. When Mara's ship arrived, she saw the alien presence for the first time not as a distant marvel, but as a neighbor. The structure that emerged from the fold was smaller than the system's spanning lattice, but it carried the same aesthetic of deliberate complexity. It was not symmetrical, but balanced, its forms shaped by function rather than ornament. Energy flowed along visible channels, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested internal processes beyond human comprehension. There was no sudden opening of communications. Instead, the alien vessel mirrored the human ship's orientation, matching rotation and relative velocity with effortless precision. The gesture was unmistakable. "We are here with you. We will not impose our frame upon yours." Mara felt a knot in her chest loosen, just slightly. This was not an enemy eager to dominate. It was an intelligence accustomed to considering perspectives other than its own. The first exchange did not use sound or text, but shared simulation. The alien vessel projected a model into the space between them, a three-dimensional construct of simple shapes representing physical principles both species understood. The model evolved, adding layers of complexity as each side responded, adjusting parameters, testing assumptions. It was a conversation conducted through shared curiosity. Mara found herself smiling despite the tension. This, at least, was familiar. Scientists arguing with equations rather than weapons. As the exchange deepened, patterns emerged. The aliens, who identified themselves through a concept that translated loosely to continuance of many, had existed for a span of time that dwarfed human history. They had not evolved on a single world, but across a cluster of environments, adapting through both biological and artificial means. Their society prized stability, not as stagnation, but as resilience against cosmic catastrophe. They had witnessed stellar flares that sterilized systems, gravitational events that tore habitats apart, and they had survived by planning on scales humans were only beginning to contemplate. When the topic turned to humanity, Mara presented a portrait stripped of propaganda. She spoke of a species driven by contradiction, capable of compassion and cruelty in equal measure. She did not hide humanity's wars or its divisions, but she framed them as symptoms of rapid growth rather than inherent malice. Humanity, she explained, was young on a cosmic scale, still learning how to live with the power it wielded. What it lacked in refinement, it made up for in adaptability. The continuance listened, adjusting the shared model to reflect human inputs. When they responded, it was with a question that cut to the core of the meeting. Why should we allow you to expand further into the shared cosmos? The phrasing was not accusatory, but it carried an implication of authority. The continuance had the means to restrict, to guide, perhaps even to eliminate. They had seen others rise and fall. Humanity was not the first to knock at the door of the wider universe. Mara did not answer immediately. She understood that this was not a test of rhetoric, but of values. She spoke of humanity's drive to explore not as a hunger for conquest, but as a refusal to accept confinement. Humans, she said, had been shaped by a world that tried to kill them at every turn. They had survived by pushing boundaries, by taking risks others would deem irrational. That same impulse had carried them to the stars. To deny it would be to deny what they were. The continuance countered with examples of civilizations that had burned bright and brief, consuming resources and destabilizing regions of space before collapsing. They had learned to intervene, to set limits, to prune growth for the sake of the whole. They asked if humanity would accept guidance, constraints designed to prevent harm on a scale no single species should be allowed to inflict. The question hung between them, heavy with consequence. Mara knew that agreeing too readily would paint humanity as pliable, while refusal could mark them as dangerous. She chose a third path. Humanity, she said, would accept knowledge. They would listen to warnings, study examples, and adjust their models of the future accordingly. But they would not accept imposed limits enforced by an external power. Growth constrained by fear was not stability, but stagnation. Humanity had learned, often painfully, that progress required the freedom to fail and the resolve to learn from those failures. The continuance processed this response, the shared model branching into countless simulations. Mara watched as outcomes diverged, some ending in cooperation, others in conflict. She realized that the aliens were not judging humanity by a static standard, but by probability. They were weighing the risk humanity posed against the potential value of another perspective in the long struggle against entropy. In the end, the continuance made an offer that surprised her. They would open limited channels of exchange, sharing technology and data in controlled increments. Humanity would be allowed to expand, but under observation. Not surveillance in the human sense, but monitoring for patterns that mirrored past disasters. If humanity demonstrated the ability to self-correct on larger scales, the constraints would loosen. If not, intervention would follow. It was not equality, but it was not subjugation either. It was a probationary relationship, born of caution and curiosity. Mara accepted on behalf of humanity, knowing that some would bristle at the implication of oversight. She also knew that refusing would likely lead to worse outcomes. This was the price of entering a universe already shaped by older hands. As the meeting drew to a close, the continuance offered one final observation. Humanity's greatest strength, they noted, was not its technology or its numbers, but its capacity for stubborn hope. Where other species optimized for efficiency, humans persisted in the face of apparent futility. They rebuilt after disasters that should have ended them. They clung to ideals even when betrayed by reality. This trait, the continuance suggested, could either make humanity a destabilizing force or an unexpected ally against the slow decay that claimed all things. When Mara's ship turned back toward human space, carrying the weight of a tentative accord, she felt both relief and dread. The universe was no longer an empty stage awaiting human ambition. It was a crowded arena, watched by eyes that measured worth in survival curves and long-term equilibria. Humanity had stepped into that arena not as a conqueror, but as a contender whose greatest weapon was an unyielding refusal to give up. The news of first contact, when finally released, shook every world touched by human presence. There were celebrations and protests, fear and wonder in equal measure. Some saw the agreement as a betrayal of sovereignty, others as a lifeline. But beneath the noise, a quieter shift took place. Humanity began to see itself not as the pinnacle of creation, but as part of a vast, ongoing experiment. The stars were no longer just destinations, they were witnesses. In the months that followed, as data flowed between species and new possibilities opened, a subtle change took root in human culture. Engineers designed with longer timelines in mind. Politicians found themselves forced to justify decisions not just in years, but in centuries. Artists and philosophers grappled with the idea that humanity's story was a chapter, not the whole book. It was unsettling, but it was also invigorating. The universe had answered humanity's call not with annihilation, but with a challenge. And humanity, true to form, began to prepare not just to survive that challenge, but to redefine it. The agreement with the continuance of many did not arrive as a neatly packaged law or treaty that could be signed and archived. It unfolded instead as a living process, a series of exchanges that forced humanity to confront its own assumptions about progress, power, and time. The first data transfers were deliberately modest, focusing on shared astrophysics and materials science principles that built upon what humans already knew. There were no miraculous devices handed over, no instant leaps into godlike capability. The continuance was careful, almost pedagogical, as if testing whether humanity would chew thoughtfully or choke on abundance. Human scientists quickly realized that the alien knowledge was structured less like a database and more like a lineage of ideas. Each concept carried with it annotations of failed approaches, marginal improvements, and contextual warnings about conditions under which it became dangerous. It was knowledge shaped by memory on a civilizational scale. For humans, accustomed to rediscovering the same mistakes every few generations, this was both exhilarating and humbling. Entire research programs were upended when long-standing theoretical dead ends were revealed to be paths already walked and abandoned by minds far older. Yet not all reactions were gratitude. On several worlds, movements arose that rejected the exchange outright. They argued that accepting alien guidance, even indirectly, would erode humanity's independence and dull its creative edge. History, they warned, was filled with examples of societies that stagnated once external authority dictated acceptable outcomes. These dissenters were not confined to fringe groups. Influential leaders echoed their concerns, framing the continuance not as cautious overseers, but as gatekeepers protecting their own dominance of the cosmos. Mara Sen found herself drawn back into the center of debate despite her desire to step away. Her role as the first emissary made her a symbol, and symbols rarely get to retire quietly. She traveled between systems, speaking not as a diplomat delivering orders, but as a witness to possibility. She emphasized that the agreement did not strip humanity of agency. It challenged humanity to grow up faster than it otherwise might, to think beyond the immediate horizon of profit and survival. Some listened, others heard only constraint. The continuance, for their part, observed without visible interference. Their monitoring manifested through subtle probes and passive sensors seeded along expansion routes humanity had already charted. When humans noticed these devices, the continuance did not deny their presence. Instead, they explained their function openly, reinforcing the idea that secrecy was more destabilizing than oversight. This transparency disarmed some critics, while infuriating others who resented the casual confidence with which the aliens operated. As months turned into years, the impact of the exchange began to show in unexpected ways. One of the earliest breakthroughs emerged from a collaboration between human engineers and continuance theoreticians focused on habitat resilience. Rather than designing structures that resisted environmental stress through brute strength, the combined approach favored adaptive architectures that redistributed forces dynamically. Habitats built on this principle did not simply withstand asteroid impacts or pressure fluctuations. They flowed around them, absorbing energy and reshaping themselves in real time. For frontier colonies accustomed to living one accident away from disaster, this shift was transformative. These successes bolstered public support for the exchange, but they also sharpened the scrutiny. Every advancement was examined for hidden costs, every failure magnified as evidence of alien manipulation. When a prototype adaptive habitat malfunctioned on a mining outpost, leading to loss of life, outrage flared across networks. Investigations revealed that the failure stemmed from a human modification made to cut costs, not from the underlying alien principles. Still, the nuance was lost in the rush to assign blame. Trust, once strained, is slow to heal. The continuance responded to the incident with what many humans found unsettling calm. They expressed regret, provided detailed analyses, and adjusted future data releases to emphasize safeguards against exactly such shortcuts. There was no hint of judgment or threat. To some, this restraint was reassuring. To others, it felt condescending, as if the aliens expected humans to err and were merely documenting the pattern. The idea that humanity was being studied not just as partners, but as a case study gnawed at collective pride. Beneath the political turbulence, a quieter revolution was taking place in how humans perceived themselves. Exposure to continuance history revealed cycles of rise and collapse spanning millions of years. Civilizations that had once rivaled stars in energy consumption vanished, leaving behind only faint imprints in spacetime. The continuance did not romanticize these losses. They treated extinction as data, a consequence of misaligned incentives and unchecked growth. For humans, whose historical memory rarely extended beyond a few thousand years, this perspective was profoundly destabilizing. It reframed ambition as something that could be measured, modeled, and, if necessary, curtailed. Educational systems began to adapt. Children on core worlds learned not only human history, but comparative civilizational studies derived from alien records. They debated ethical frameworks evolved under different physical laws, grappled with scenarios where survival demanded choices humans had never faced. Some educators worried that this would dilute human cultural identity. Others argued that it would strengthen it by forcing clearer articulation of values. The classroom became a battleground where the future of humanity's self-conception was quietly negotiated. Mara watched these developments with mixed feelings. She had hoped that contact would inspire unity or at least a shared sense of purpose. Instead, it magnified existing fractures. Worlds that benefited most from the exchange championed deeper integration, while those left behind accused the system of favoring established centers of power. The continuance, with their insistence on gradualism, inadvertently mirrored old inequalities, feeding resentment among the margins. It was during this period of simmering tension that humanity encountered its first real test under the new cosmic order. A previously unknown phenomenon was detected along a peripheral trade route, a region of space where physical constants fluctuated unpredictably, disrupting navigation and threatening nearby colonies. Human probes sent to investigate were lost, their data streams dissolving into noise. The affected region expanded slowly but steadily, its boundaries shifting like a living thing. Human scientists were baffled. Existing models could not account for the behavior. The continuance, when consulted, identified the phenomenon as a remnant instability left behind by a long-extinct civilization's attempt to manipulate vacuum energy on a massive scale. It was, in effect, a wound in space-time, slowly healing, but dangerous to anything that ventured too close. The continuance explained that they had encountered similar scars before and had learned to contain them, though never without cost. The revelation sent a chill through human space. This was not a hostile force that could be negotiated with or fought, but a consequence of technological hubris echoing across eons. It was a stark illustration of the continuance's warnings embodied in a tangible threat. The affected colonies demanded action, fearing abandonment. Human leadership faced a dilemma. Addressing the instability would require resources and techniques only the continuance possessed. Accepting that help openly would strengthen arguments for alien oversight. Refusing it risked catastrophe. After heated debate, a joint task force was formed. For the first time, human vessels and continuance constructs operated in close coordination, sharing real-time data and control protocols. Mara was asked to observe, her experience serving as a bridge between perspectives. She agreed reluctantly, aware that every interaction would be scrutinized by those eager to find fault. The operation revealed profound differences in approach. Human crews favored direct intervention, deploying containment fields and reinforcement structures to pin the instability in place. The continuance advocated for a slower method, one that involved altering surrounding spacetime gradients to encourage the wound to collapse inward naturally. The human method promised faster results but carried higher risk. The alien approach required patience and precise control over vast areas. As tensions rose, a compromise was reached. The task force would begin with the continuance method, but human contingencies would stand ready if containment failed. Days stretched into weeks as subtle adjustments were made, invisible to the naked eye but monumental in effect. The instability's expansion slowed, then halted. Colonists watched anxiously as sensor readings fluctuated, waiting for the moment it would either recede or erupt. When the wound finally collapsed, releasing a burst of energy that dissipated harmlessly into the void, relief swept through the task force. The success was undeniable. Lives had been saved without loss, yet the victory carried an undercurrent of unease. Humanity had witnessed a problem it could not solve alone, and the solution had required trusting an intelligence whose priorities were not entirely aligned with human instincts. In the aftermath, public discourse shifted. The abstract debate over alien oversight gained a concrete example. Supporters argued that cooperation had prevented disaster. Critics countered that humanity should accelerate its own research to avoid dependence. The continuance made no effort to shape the narrative. They simply provided the data and withdrew, leaving humans to argue among themselves. For Mara, the experience crystallized a growing realization. The continuance did not seek to dominate or uplift humanity out of benevolence. They were engaged in a long struggle against cosmic entropy, and every new intelligence was evaluated as either a liability or an asset in that struggle. Humanity's fate would depend not on declarations of intent, but on demonstrated capacity to learn from consequences larger than itself. As humanity resumed its expansion, cautiously pushing into new regions, the stars felt closer and more distant at the same time. The universe was no longer a blank canvas, but a palimpsest written over countless times by hands both vanished and enduring. Humanity was adding its marks, now tentative but persistent. The chapter of first contact had ended not with triumph or submission, but with a question still unfolding. Could a species defined by restless ambition learn to think in terms of epochs rather than generations? Could it retain its fierce individuality while accepting that it was no longer alone nor supreme? The answer was not yet written, but the pressure of that question would shape every step humanity took from that moment onward, under the watchful, patient gaze of unyielding stars. The years following the containment of the space-time instability marked a turning point, not because humanity suddenly trusted the continuance of many, but because it could no longer pretend that ignorance was a viable strategy. The universe had revealed itself as layered, scarred, and shaped by choices whose consequences outlived their makers. That knowledge seeped into human decision-making in uneven ways, resisted in some quarters, embraced in others, but never entirely ignored again. Expansion resumed, yet it did so with a new vocabulary. Words like inevitability and destiny slowly gave way to probability and risk. Humanity did not become cautious by nature, but it learned, grudgingly, to simulate futures it once would have charged into blindly. This shift was most visible at the edges of human space, where colonies functioned less as extensions of centralized power and more as experiments in survival. Frontier settlements began to incorporate continuance-derived predictive frameworks, not as commandments, but as tools. These frameworks modeled resource depletion, social stress, and technological feedback loops across centuries. They did not dictate outcomes, but they highlighted thresholds beyond which recovery became exponentially harder. For settlers accustomed to making decisions based on immediate necessity, this long view was unsettling. It forced them to confront the idea that survival was not just about enduring the next storm or supply delay, but about maintaining coherence across generations. Some communities rejected these models outright, declaring them antithetical to human spirit. Others adapted them creatively, using the predictions as challenges to be met rather than warnings to retreat. On one harsh world orbiting a dim red star, settlers deliberately pushed their society to the edge of a modeled collapse point, then tested whether cultural cohesion and adaptive governance could pull them back. The experiment was risky and controversial, but it succeeded. The settlement stabilized, emerging with a stronger sense of shared responsibility. Observers across human space debated whether this proved the models wrong or validated them. The answer, inconveniently, was both. The continuance observed these developments with interest that bordered on approval, though they never expressed it in terms humans found emotionally satisfying. Their communications remained precise, analytical, and devoid of praise. Instead, they offered comparative data, showing how similar experiments had fared among other civilizations. In many cases, those civilizations had failed, collapsing into authoritarian control or fracturing under the strain. Humanity's partial successes puzzled the continuance. Humans were not optimized for long-term stability, yet they displayed a stubborn resistance to total failure. They bent where others broke. This resistance became more visible when humanity encountered another intelligence, one far less ancient than the continuance, but far more aggressive. The encounter occurred near a cluster of resource-rich systems that humanity had surveyed but not yet settled. Human prospecting vessels detected artificial signals emanating from the region, crude by continuance standards but unmistakably intentional. Before formal contact protocols could be established, several prospecting ships were intercepted and forcibly boarded. The attackers made no effort at communication beyond demands for surrender of cargo and navigation data. The attackers were a coalition of species bound together by convenience rather than shared culture. Their technology suggested rapid advancement fueled by conquest, scavenging innovations from those they overpowered. They did not build patiently, they accumulated. To them, human ships represented opportunity rather than mystery. The initial skirmishes were brief and brutal. Human crews, unprepared for direct confrontation, suffered losses before retreating and broadcasting warnings. News of the attacks ignited fury across human space. For the first time since first contact, the threat was not abstract or philosophical. It was immediate, violent, and personal. Calls for retaliation drowned out more measured voices. Humanity had spent years arguing about oversight and restraint. Now, an enemy had declared itself through action, and restraint felt like weakness. The continuance responded to humanity's reports with an analysis that chilled many who read it. The coalition, they explained, was a known entity, though not a unified civilization in the traditional sense. It was a recurrent pattern, emerging in regions where technological diffusion outpaced ethical or social integration. The continuance had intervened against similar coalitions in the past, often decisively. However, they warned that direct intervention on humanity's behalf would alter the evaluation of humanity's long-term impact. A species that relied on older powers to fight its wars would never be trusted with unrestricted growth. The implication was clear. If humanity wanted to be considered a stabilizing presence rather than a liability, it would have to respond largely on its own. This revelation fractured human leadership. Some argued that refusing continuance military support was reckless pride. Others countered that this was precisely the kind of trial humanity needed to face if it hoped to be taken seriously on a cosmic scale. The debate was not resolved cleanly. In the end, a compromise emerged. Humanity would lead the response, but it would do so informed by continuance strategic models and historical data. The aliens would advise, not command. Mara Sen was drawn back once more, this time as a reluctant strategist. Her understanding of continuance reasoning made her a valuable interpreter between alien analysis and human instinct. She sat in planning chambers where projections of conflict played out across star systems, each outcome branching into countless variations. The models did not glorify victory. They treated it as a temporary state, one that often seeded future instability if mishandled. Human military planners bristled at this approach. They were trained to seek decisive engagements, to break enemies through overwhelming force. The continuance models suggested something else entirely. The coalition's strength lay in its predatory mobility. It thrived on rapid strikes and withdrawal, on keeping opponents off balance. Meeting it head-on would play into its strengths. Instead, the models recommended constraining its options, forcing it into defensive postures where internal fractures would surface. Implementing such a strategy required coordination on a scale humanity had rarely achieved. It meant sacrificing immediate gains to shape long-term conditions. Trade routes were rerouted to starve the coalition of easy targets. Decoy convoys were used not to lure the enemy into traps, but to map their decision-making patterns. Human forces avoided large-scale engagements, focusing instead on disrupting logistics and sowing mistrust among the coalition's member species. The campaign was slow, frustrating, and politically unpopular. Casual observers saw only retreat and evasion, mistaking patience for fear. Protests erupted on core worlds, accusing leadership of cowardice and over-reliance on alien doctrine. Some worlds threatened to take independent action, raising private fleets to pursue vengeance. Then, gradually, the effects became visible. Coalition raids grew less coordinated. Infighting increased as resources dwindled. Member species accused one another of hoarding or betrayal. When human forces finally engaged directly, they did so against fragmented opponents rather than a unified front. The battles were still costly, but they lacked the desperate intensity of the initial encounters. The coalition collapsed not in a single dramatic defeat, but in a series of withdrawals and dissolutions. The aftermath posed its own challenges. Humanity faced captured populations who had participated in the coalition out of necessity rather than malice. Executing or abandoning them would reinforce the cycle the continuance warned against. Absorbing them risked internal unrest and cultural strain. Once again, humanity stood at a crossroads between expedience and principle. Guided by continuance examples and human ideals, a third option emerged. The captured populations were offered conditional integration into protected zones under strict but transparent governance. They would be monitored, not imprisoned, given access to resources and education in exchange for disarmament and cooperation. It was an experiment fraught with risk. Critics warned of infiltration and future rebellion. Supporters argued that breaking the cycle required demonstrating alternatives to predation. Years passed, and the experiment did not collapse. It did not produce instant harmony either, but it prevented renewed violence. Some former coalition members became advocates for the system that had spared them, lending credibility to humanity's approach. The continuance took note. In their internal evaluations, humanity's probability curve shifted, not dramatically, but measurably. For Mara, the campaign left deep scars. She had seen lives lost to strategies that required sacrifice without guarantee of recognition. She had argued against impulses that felt viscerally satisfying but strategically disastrous. She understood now why the continuance valued stability so highly. It was not born of complacency, but of grief accumulated over millennia. As humanity emerged from the conflict, changed but intact, a subtle shift occurred in how the continuance communicated. Their data packets began to include speculative models rather than solely historical ones. They asked questions, not just answered them. What strategies might humans propose for managing future encounters? How might human cultural resilience be leveraged at larger scales? These were not rhetorical inquiries. They signaled a recalibration. Humanity had not proven itself harmless. It had proven itself capable of restraint without paralysis, of force without total dehumanization. It had demonstrated something rare, the ability to learn mid-crisis, to adjust course while the outcome was still uncertain. The universe remained vast and dangerous, filled with relics of ambition gone wrong and intelligences walking precarious paths. Humanity's place within it was still provisional. Yet for the first time since the discovery of the lattice in the distant system, there was a growing sense that humanity was not merely being tolerated, it was being considered. Under the unyielding stars, amid the long memory of cosmic failure, a young species had stumbled, fought, and adapted. It had not transcended its nature, but it had begun to understand it. And in that understanding lay the fragile promise that humanity might become not a spark that burned out quickly, but a flame capable of enduring the cold vastness that surrounded it. Consideration, once extended, proved to be a heavier burden than suspicion. Humanity discovered that being watched as a potential peer rather than a curiosity altered the tone of every interaction with the continuance of many. The data exchanges became denser, the scenarios more complex, and the expectations implicit rather than stated. Where once the continuance had explained outcomes, they now asked humans to predict them first. Where once they had offered warnings, they now waited to see whether humanity would recognize danger on its own. This shift was subtle enough that many missed it entirely, but those who worked closely with continuance interfaces felt the pressure immediately. Humanity was no longer being tested for basic competence. It was being evaluated for judgment. This change coincided with an internal transformation that had been building quietly for decades. The generation that had grown up after first contact reached maturity. They had never known a universe presumed empty of other minds. For them, alien perspectives were not an intrusion, but a fact of existence, like gravity or radiation. They argued less about whether humanity should adapt and more about how. This generational divide strained older institutions, whose structures had been forged in an era when human exceptionalism went largely unchallenged. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in the Assembly of Worlds, the loose governing body that coordinated policy across human space. Its debates grew longer and more abstract, drifting away from immediate concerns toward questions of trajectory and legacy. Some delegates spoke openly about the possibility that humanity might one day be asked to assume responsibilities beyond its own survival. Others recoiled at the idea, insisting that protecting human autonomy must remain paramount. The assembly was not paralyzed, but it was increasingly introspective, its decisions slowed by the awareness that missteps could echo far beyond any single system. The continuance accelerated this introspection by introducing a new category of shared information. They revealed the existence of what they termed convergence zones, regions of space where multiple expanding civilizations were statistically likely to intersect within a few thousand years. These zones were not inherently hostile, but history suggested they were prone to cascading conflict if unmanaged. The continuance had spent eons attempting to moderate these intersections, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Humanity, they implied, was on course to enter several such zones sooner than it realized. The revelation was met with unease. Humanity had only just survived its first serious external conflict. The idea of navigating intersections with multiple unknown intelligences felt premature, almost cruel. Yet the data was clear. Human expansion vectors, driven by resource needs and settlement patterns, were converging with those of other species still beyond direct contact. Avoiding these zones entirely would require drastic rerouting and abandonment of promising systems. Entering them unprepared risked repeating the cycle of predation and collapse humanity had narrowly avoided. Once again, the continuance did not prescribe a solution. They provided models, probabilities, and historical parallels, then stepped back. The message was unmistakable. Humanity could no longer rely on reactive ethics, forming principles only after disaster struck. It would need to articulate, in advance, how it intended to coexist in a crowded universe. Mara Sen, now older and carrying the weariness of someone who had spent too long at the fault lines of history, was invited to chair a new initiative. Its mandate was ambitious to the point of arrogance, to define a coherent human approach to interspecies coexistence that could scale beyond individual encounters. Mara resisted at first. She had never believed in grand doctrines. Her successes had come from improvisation and empathy, not from universal rules. But she recognized that the moment demanded more than case-by-case wisdom. The initiative drew thinkers from across human space, not just diplomats and strategists, but sociologists, ecologists, engineers, and artists. They argued fiercely, often talking past one another, united only by the understanding that whatever framework emerged would shape humanity's future for centuries. Some proposed strict non-interference, advocating withdrawal from contested regions and minimal contact. Others argued for proactive engagement, claiming that early cooperation could prevent later violence. A vocal minority insisted that humanity should assert itself decisively, establishing norms through strength rather than negotiation. What distinguished these debates from earlier ones was the presence of the continuance as silent context. Every proposal was weighed not just against human history, but against a catalogue of alien failures and successes spanning millions of years. Patterns emerged. Civilizations that isolated themselves often survived longer, but stagnated, eventually becoming irrelevant or vulnerable to unforeseen shifts. Those that expanded aggressively burned out quickly, collapsing under the weight of resistance and internal decay. The rare few that endured combined restraint with adaptability, adjusting their principles without abandoning them entirely. Gradually, a framework began to take shape, less a doctrine than a set of constraints. Humanity would prioritize transparency in its expansion, making its intentions legible to others whenever possible. It would treat first contact as a prolonged process rather than a single event, allowing trust to build incrementally. It would reserve the right to defend itself, but reject preemptive violence as a default strategy. Most controversially, it would accept that some regions of space might be better left unclaimed, serving as buffers or shared zones rather than property. The proposal was far from universally accepted. Critics derided it as naive, arguing that it assumed a level of goodwill the universe had not earned. Others feared it would shackle humanity's growth, leaving it vulnerable to less restrained actors. Yet support grew, particularly among younger populations and frontier communities who understood the cost of unchecked conflict. After months of negotiation, the Assembly of Worlds ratified the framework, not as binding law, but as a guiding charter. Humanity, for the first time, had articulated a vision of itself not as a conqueror or a hermit, but as a participant in a larger system. The continuance responded with something unprecedented. They shared a set of simulations projecting humanity's long-term impact under various adherence levels to the Charter. The models were not flattering. Even under optimal conditions, humanity's expansion introduced volatility into local cosmic ecosystems, but the volatility diminished over time if humans adhered to their principles, smoothing into a pattern the continuance classified as manageable. It was the closest thing to endorsement they had ever offered. Then came the setback. A distant human faction, operating beyond the immediate reach of the Assembly, encountered an emerging civilization within one of the identified convergence zones. Instead of following the Charter, the faction moved quickly to secure advantage, offering technology in exchange for exclusive access to resources and strategic positions. The arrangement destabilized the region almost immediately. Rival groups within the emerging civilization resisted, violence escalated, and the situation spiraled into open conflict. Refugees fled into neighboring systems, spreading chaos. The continuance flagged the incident with unusual urgency. This was precisely the scenario their warnings had anticipated. Left unchecked, the conflict could draw in other actors, triggering a cascade that would take centuries to resolve. Humanity faced a brutal choice: intervene decisively against its own faction, enforcing the Charter through force, or allow the situation to unfold, preserving internal autonomy at the cost of external stability. The Assembly fractured under the weight of the decision. Accusations of hypocrisy flew. Some argued that punishing the faction would validate fears that the Charter was merely a tool for centralized control. Others countered that failure to act would render the Charter meaningless, proving to the continuance that humanity lacked the will to enforce its own standards. Mara spoke rarely during the final debates, but when she did, her words cut through the noise. She reminded the Assembly that humanity had always defined itself by the choices it made under pressure. This, she said, was not about pleasing the continuance or preserving appearances. It was about whether humanity believed its own principles were worth defending, even when inconvenient. The intervention that followed was swift and narrowly targeted. Human forces neutralized the faction's military capabilities and dismantled its exploitative agreements. They did not annex territory or impose governance. Instead, they facilitated negotiations among the affected groups, drawing on continuance mediation techniques but adapting them to human sensibilities. The process was messy and imperfect, but the violence subsided. The region stabilized, albeit scarred. The cost was significant. The intervening forces suffered losses. Political backlash erupted across human space. Some worlds threatened secession, furious at what they perceived as overreach. Trust in the Assembly wavered, yet something else happened alongside the outrage. The Charter, once abstract, became real. It was no longer a set of aspirational statements. It was a line humanity had chosen to draw and to bleed for. The continuance observed the aftermath in silence. Then, weeks later, they transmitted a brief message to the Assembly and to Mara directly. It contained no praise, no condemnation. Only a single data point: a recalculated probability curve showing a reduced likelihood of large-scale future conflict in the affected convergence zone, attributable primarily to human action. For Mara, the moment carried a quiet finality. She understood that humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. It had acted not out of fear or immediate self-interest, but out of commitment to an identity it was still forming. The universe remained indifferent, vast, and dangerous. The continuance remained watchful, cautious, and slow to trust. But the relationship had changed in a way no treaty could capture. Humanity was no longer merely reacting to the cosmos. It was beginning, haltingly, to take responsibility for its footprint within it. And in that acceptance lay both the greatest danger and the greatest promise of all. Responsibility, once accepted, has a way of reshaping every familiar structure until even the past feels altered by its presence. In the decades following the intervention in the convergence zone, humanity discovered that acting as a stabilizing force carried costs that could not be neatly isolated to distant frontiers. Decisions made to prevent conflicts light years away reverberated back through trade networks, political alliances, and cultural identities. The charter that had once been debated as philosophy now functioned as a constant constraint, forcing leaders and citizens alike to confront trade-offs they would previously have deferred or ignored. The most immediate consequence was internal strain. Worlds that had thrived on aggressive expansion or speculative exploitation found their ambitions curtailed. Investment flowed more cautiously, redirected towards sustainability rather than rapid extraction. Some economies faltered in the short term, fueling resentment against what critics derided as moral imperialism turned inward. They argued that humanity was sacrificing its own prosperity to uphold standards no other species had agreed to follow. The phrase self-imposed guardianship became a rallying cry for opposition movements. Yet alongside this resistance, quieter transformations took root. Industries that adapted to the new constraints discovered unexpected advantages. Technologies designed for long-term ecological balance proved more resilient to supply disruptions. Governance models that emphasized transparency reduced internal conflict, freeing resources previously spent on suppression or recovery. These successes rarely made headlines, but they accumulated steadily, forming a counter-narrative to the rhetoric of decline. The continuance of many deepened its engagement during this period, though never in ways that felt overtly directive. They began to include humanity in broader informational exchanges, sharing anonymized data about other civilizations approaching critical thresholds. Humanity was not asked to intervene, but to observe, to learn. The implicit message was unsettling. This was what the continuance watched every day, countless societies balancing on the edge between endurance and collapse. One particular dataset drew intense attention among human analysts. It detailed a civilization that had once followed a trajectory strikingly similar to humanity's, marked by rapid expansion, internal diversity, and a capacity for both cooperation and violence. That civilization had attempted to formalize a charter of coexistence not unlike humanity's own, but it had failed to enforce it consistently. Exceptions became precedents. Precedents became erosion. Within a few thousand years, the charter was a historical curiosity, cited but ignored, and the civilization fractured under renewed cycles of conflict. The lesson was clear and uncomfortable. Principles that were not defended under pressure were worse than useless. They created illusions of safety that delayed necessary action. Humanity's recent intervention had avoided that fate, but only narrowly. The continuance did not state this outright. They did not need to. The parallel was unmistakable. Mara Sen, now approaching the end of her public life, spent much of her time mentoring those who would inherit the burden she had carried. She spoke less about tactics and more about endurance. She warned that the greatest threat humanity faced was not alien hostility or cosmic disaster, but fatigue. The temptation to compromise quietly, to allow exceptions for convenience, would grow stronger as memories of early crises faded. Maintaining coherence across centuries, she said, would require a kind of courage that rarely felt heroic in the moment. Her warnings gained urgency when a new challenge emerged, one that tested humanity's principles in a subtler way than open conflict ever could. Advances in continuance, shared theoretical frameworks, enabled humans to manipulate spacetime on scales previously thought impossible. The techniques promised unprecedented efficiency in travel and energy distribution, effectively shrinking the distances between systems. Used carefully, they could reduce expansion pressure by making existing territory more accessible. Used recklessly, they risked creating instabilities similar to the ancient wound humanity had once helped contain. The assembly faced a dilemma that split even its most thoughtful members. Restricting the technology would slow progress and frustrate worlds eager for connection. Allowing widespread experimentation risked long-term damage that no single generation would live to see. The continuance provided models but withheld recommendation, a silence that carried weight. They had seen this choice before. Public debate was fierce. Proponents framed the technology as a moral imperative, arguing that reducing isolation and scarcity would prevent conflict. Opponents warned that humanity was once again standing at the edge of hubris, tempted to reshape the universe without fully grasping the consequences. The argument was not about capability, but restraint. What ultimately tipped the balance was not logic alone, but memory. Survivors and descendants from regions affected by past instabilities spoke of living under constant threat from forces no one could fully control. Their testimony cut through abstract projections, grounding the debate in lived experience. The Assembly authorized limited deployment under strict oversight, with mandatory review cycles measured not in years, but in generations. It was an unprecedented commitment to delayed gratification, and it was deeply unpopular in some quarters. As implementation began, humanity felt the weight of being watched not just by the continuance, but by itself. Every deviation from protocol sparked scrutiny. Whistleblowers were protected rather than silenced, a choice that slowed projects but strengthened trust. Progress continued, uneven and frustrating, but it did not spiral. The continuance acknowledged this restraint in the only way they knew how. They expanded humanity's access to convergence zone mediation data, effectively inviting humans to participate in early warning systems for future interspecies conflicts. This was not an honorary gesture. It was work demanding constant attention and difficult judgments. Humanity accepted. Through this participation, humans gained a clearer view of the continuance themselves. Beneath their calm exterior lay a civilization shaped by loss on a scale humans could barely imagine. Entire regions of space rendered uninhabitable by ancient mistakes. Species that had once been allies reduced to records and simulations. The continuance's caution was not superiority, but mourning codified into policy. This understanding softened some of humanity's resentment. It also sharpened resolve. Humans recognized in the continuance a possible future version of themselves, one tempered by time and regret. Whether that future was something to aspire to or avoid remained an open question. Mara Sen did not live to see the long-term outcome of these choices. Her death was quiet, unremarkable by historical standards. There were no grand ceremonies, only local remembrances and a brief acknowledgement from the Assembly. The continuance noted her passing in their records, marking her as a statistically significant node in humanity's developmental arc. To them, that was respect. For humanity, her legacy was less quantifiable, but no less real. She had embodied a way of engaging with the universe that neither surrendered nor dominated. In the years after her death, References to her words surfaced whenever difficult choices arose, invoked by those arguing for patience in the face of pressure. As the centuries edged forward, humanity's expansion slowed but did not stop. It flowed around constraints, finding paths that balanced curiosity with caution. New worlds were settled more deliberately, integrated into networks designed to endure rather than explode outward. The stars were still unyielding, still indifferent, but humanity's relationship with them had matured. The universe did not reward this maturity with safety or certainty. Disasters still occurred, conflicts still flared. But humanity faced them with a growing awareness that survival was not a sprint toward dominance, but a long negotiation with reality itself. And in that negotiation, humanity was no longer alone, nor merely observed. It was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, a participant in the ancient, ongoing effort to ensure that intelligence, once arisen, did not extinguish itself through its own excess. Time, when measured against stars rather than lifespans, has a way of sanding sharp edges into something smoother without ever truly erasing them. Humanity entered its third century of known coexistence, with other intelligences changed in ways no single generation could fully articulate. The species that had once rushed outward, driven by scarcity and fear of limitation, now moved with a steadier cadence. Not slower in the sense of hesitation, but deliberate, each expansion weighed against models that spanned millennia. This shift did not make humanity peaceful by default, nor did it dissolve internal conflict. What it did was anchor those conflicts within a broader context, one that made purely short-sighted victories harder to justify. The continuance of many, ever patient, continued to refine its assessment. Humanity's probability curves no longer swung wildly with each crisis. Instead, they oscillated within narrower bands, reflecting a growing capacity for correction without collapse. This was not immortality, nor even long-term security, but it was rare enough to merit attention. In internal continuance discourse, humanity was no longer classified primarily as a risk factor. It had become a variable of interest. That interest was tested when the universe presented a problem no single civilization, ancient or young, had ever fully solved. Far beyond the convergence zones, in a region thought empty save for diffuse matter and cold stars, instruments detected a pattern that defied known categories. It was not an intelligence in any recognizable sense, nor a remnant of past technology. It was a process, vast and slow, consuming structure itself. Galaxies passing through its influence lost coherence, their stars flung into intergalactic voids, their matter redistributed into featureless clouds, entropy made visible. The continuance had encountered similar phenomena before, though never on this scale. They had learned to divert, delay, and sometimes contain, but never to reverse. The models were grim. Left unchecked, the process would expand for millions of years, erasing regions of complexity and reducing them to thermal equilibrium. It was not malevolent. It did not choose. It simply followed the logic of physics unrestrained. For the first time since humanity's introduction to the wider cosmos, the continuance did not merely share data. They extended an invitation. They asked humanity to participate in exploratory modeling, not because humans possessed superior technology, but because they approached problems differently. Where the continuance optimized for stability and minimization of loss, humans had a habit of asking whether loss itself could be redefined. The request sparked a reaction unlike any before it. There was no panic, no immediate fracture along political lines. Instead, there was a collective pause, a moment of recognition that this question lay beyond sovereignty or pride. This was not about defending territory or enforcing principles. It was about whether intelligence could, in any meaningful way, push back against the ultimate trend of the universe. Human research collectives mobilized alongside continuance analytical structures. The collaboration was uneven, at times strained by differences in methodology. Continuance models prioritized elegance and proven pathways. Human teams were more willing to entertain speculative approaches, even those with low probability of success but transformative potential. Many of these ideas were dismissed outright. Some were quietly archived. A few, against expectation, resisted elimination. One such concept emerged from a synthesis of human cultural philosophy and alien physics. It proposed that the process-consuming structure was not uniformly destructive, but selectively indifferent. It did not target complexity, it ignored it. The damage arose not from direct opposition, but from pass-through. If regions of space could be made dynamically adaptive rather than static, the process might diffuse rather than concentrate its effects. Complexity, in other words, could be used as a kind of turbulence, disrupting the smooth advance of entropy. The idea was unproven, risky, and required coordination on a scale that dwarfed previous efforts. Implementing it would mean reshaping entire stellar regions, not to extract energy or resources, but to create resilience against dissolution. The continuance models assigned it a low probability of success, but not zero. That distinction mattered. The decision to proceed was not framed as a gamble for salvation. It was framed as an experiment, openly acknowledged as such. Humanity understood now that certainty was a luxury rarely afforded by reality. What mattered was the willingness to act with eyes open, to accept failure without abandoning responsibility. The project unfolded over generations. Stars were shepherded into configurations designed to maximize interactive complexity. Habitats were built not as endpoints, but as nodes in a larger adaptive network. Humanity contributed not only labor and innovation, but something harder to quantify, a tolerance for unfinished solutions. Where the continuance sought closure, humans accepted that the work might never truly end. There were losses. Some regions destabilized despite precautions. Some efforts failed entirely, collapsing into the very equilibrium they sought to resist. Each failure fed back into the models, refining understanding. The process-consuming structure slowed in places, diverted in others. It did not stop, but it no longer advanced unchecked. The continuance updated their classifications. For the first time in their recorded history, they labeled a collaborative effort as net positive against universal entropy, even if marginal. The scale of the universe dwarfed the achievement, but the implication was profound. Intelligence was not merely a transient pattern doomed to fade. Under certain conditions, it could influence the long arc of decay, if not defeat it. Humanity's role in this did not elevate it above others. It did not become a leader or a savior. What it became was a catalyst, introducing approaches shaped by imperfection, persistence, and an unwillingness to accept inevitability as an excuse for inaction. The continuance recognized this not as superiority, but as complementarity. As centuries turned into millennia, the distinction between human and continuance initiatives blurred. Joint habitats emerged, designed to accommodate radically different forms of existence. Knowledge flowed less as exchange and more as shared inheritance. Humanity did not lose itself in this integration. It carried forward its contradictions, its arguments, its art and dissent. The continuance did not become more human. They became more flexible. Looking back, historians would struggle to identify a single moment when humanity truly arrived on the cosmic stage. There was no coronation, no final test passed. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of choices made under uncertainty, defended despite fatigue, and revised without surrender. Humanity had not conquered the stars, nor transcended its nature. It had learned to persist within limits, and to expand those limits responsibly. The universe remained vast, cold, and largely indifferent. Entropy still ruled the long game, but threaded through that indifference were regions of stubborn complexity, networks of minds refusing to collapse quietly into equilibrium. Humanity was one strand among many now, not the strongest, not the oldest, but unmistakably present. In the end, That was the measure of unyielding stars, not that they bent to will or granted meaning, but that they endured long enough for fragile, thinking beings to argue with the future itself. Humanity did not win that argument. It did something far more difficult. It kept it going.